Professor Guy Standing, thank you so much for your time with me and my audience today. Your work at SOAS University in London has led you to a lifetime of extensive research and advocacy on what are essentially adverse developments in the global labour market. You've widely discussed the increasingly precarious position of the millions of people who are being left behind by government policy and breakneck capitalism, essentially the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. As a result, you have helped found the Basic Income Earth Network, which promotes a basic income for all, and I reference previous discussions with Professor Jeffrey Williams and your colleague Sarath Devala on this topic. And thank you so much for your time and spending with me and my audience today. Guy, I'd like to just update the discussion in terms of your findings and thoughts on this cohort of people you describe as the precariats.
Yeah, I think I should start this discussion by giving a little context for the audience. What's happened is that we've had an economics revolution that started with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan back in the 90s. And they advocated a free market system. But what has actually happened is the development of what I call rentier capitalism, in which property rights, private property rights, and particularly the rights of finance have been steadily strengthened. So that we're in a situation today around the world, in every country, including Malaysia, including Britain and the United States and Japan, even in China, more and more of the income is going to the owners of property, financial property, physical property, and most of all, intellectual property. And in the process, people who are relying on labor and work for their income are, in effect, receiving a smaller and smaller share of the total pie, if you like. And in that process, we've seen the development of a new class structure, a class structure in every country of the world where I've worked. And I've worked in Malaysia on several occasions, economic advisor to the Prime Minister's office, for example. And I've seen this same phenomenon all over the world. And that is we have a plutocracy at the top, a tiny, tiny minority of absurdly wealthy individuals, billionaires, top of which are the Elon Musks and the Mark Zuckerbergs and the names you know. And then below them is what I call an elite, people who are serving the interests of the plutocrats and have got share options and huge incomes and salaries, and they benefit from the stock exchange and so on. And then underneath, there's what I call a salariat, people who have salaried jobs, full-time jobs, with a pension prospect at the end of it and a lifetime of middle-class living standards and so on. Now, when I was a student at Cambridge many years ago, we expected that by the end of the 20th century, the majority of people in rich countries and even middle-income countries, like Malaysia is today, would be in the salariat. The majority would be in the salariat. But in fact, that's been shrinking all over the world. And the old industrial proletariat associated with manufacturing jobs, steady manual labor, unionized and so on, that's been shrinking all over the world. And the old welfare systems were designed for that class, the proletariat. But today we have a new mass class that has grown everywhere, and that's the precariat. And the precariat can be defined very briefly, and I've done it extensively in my book called The Precariat, The New Dangerous Class, in 3 dimensions. First, they're having to put up with a life of unstable labor, insecure labor, where they don't have an occupational narrative to give to themselves. They're not becoming something that they can be proud of. And they're having to do a lot of work for labor, work that they need to do that doesn't get remunerated, doesn't get recognized, but they have to do it. Retraining, applying for benefits, etc., etc. And they don't have the sort of activity that's relevant for their education. It's the first mass class in history whose level of education on average is above the level of job they can expect to get and obtain. That's a unique issue in history. That's the first dimension. I don't like the term precarious work or precarious labor because that's different. The second dimension is they are experiencing stagnant wages, a loss or non-attainment of pensions, of paid holidays, paid medical leave, all those things that the salariat came to expect. And they're having to rely on low, volatile money wages. And in addition, they're living on the edge of unsustainable debt. It's the first mass class in history that have systematically exploited by debt. This is dramatically different, which means that they are living on the edge of insecurity. And the third dimension is that they are losing the rights of citizenship. Whether they're migrants or ordinary people, they're losing social rights, they're losing cultural rights, they're losing political rights. They don't see in the political system political movements representing the precariat. And that leads to the worst feature of the precariat. They feel like beggars in the sense that they have to ask for favors from landlords, from employers, from parents, from the state. They don't have rights. They are precarious in the sense that the original meaning of precarity was to obtain by prayer. They have to ask for favors all the time. And this means that the precariat is suffering, as I've described in my books, from what I call the 4 A's. The first A is alienation. They have to do a lot of things they don't want to do, and they can't do things they would like to do. They also suffer from anomie, a sense of hopelessness and leads to passivity. And the third, which is anxiety, constant anxiety. They're living insecure lives all the time. And the fourth A, of course, is anger. I don't like the term, and you've used it perfectly normally, I understand it, but I don't like the term left behind, because this is a new group that is being created. It's functional in the system of rentier capitalism. They're not left behind, they're being created as a class in the making. And this leads to the worst feature of our era, is that people in the precariat, and not just those in the precariat, are faced with society of uncertainty. Everything is uncertain. Now, for an economist like me, uncertainty is a very special form of insecurity. With most forms of insecurity, you can have an insurance system. You can work out the probability of being hit by accident or by unemployment or illness or whatever, and you can have an insurance system. With uncertainty, it's about unknown unknowns. You don't know what's going to hit you. You don't know what shock is waiting around the corner. It could hit you and me, and it could hit anybody. And uncertainty involves incredibly stressful existence. And that this is one of the reasons why I support a basic income. We'll come back to that, no doubt. But what you've got is millions and millions of people, including Malaysia and all countries of Southeast Asia. I've worked a lot in South Korea, and my books have been translated into Korean and Chinese and Japanese. And I get all the time, every day, I will receive at least one, and maybe many more than one, email from people in various countries of the world saying, your books are about me, Cariat. My book has been translated into 25 languages, which I never expected, of course. And I've given over 800 presentations in 49 countries. Now, that sort of thing doesn't happen unless what you're dealing with is fundamental to the whole global system. And that's where we are today. It's a very dangerous moment, and populist politicians are playing on the fears and insecurities of the precariat, including people like Donald Trump and, in my own country, Nigel Farage. They have got a skillful appeal, but it's an appeal to look backwards.
Guys, I might say, and you would have heard this refrain before, that there are some people, not all men are created equal, right? And you talk about someone like Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos. Well, at some point in time in his early 30s, I think Jeff Bezos was in employment. I think he was a merchant banker of some sort, and I think he left the workforce and he decided to start Amazon. So what I'm trying to say is that the people that he described, who are billionaires necessarily, they're the ones who took the risk, rolled the dice, and went through immense personal hardship to get where they are. And for example, Jeff Bezos, there could be 99 of them who failed out of 100. I might suggest to you that inequality has always existed because some people have done more for themselves than others. How would you respond to that?
It's very easy to respond to that because I've written a book called The Corruption of Capitalism. And I joke that Bill Gates, for example, should bow down every day in the morning and worship a piece of legislation that was passed in 1994, which is called TRIPS. And TRIPS was passed in Geneva, where I've lived and worked in the United Nations. And TRIPS is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property. And what it did was it globalized the American intellectual property rights system. And before 1994, the equivalents of the Jeff Bezoses and the Mark Zuckerbergs and all the others, the names you and I could mention, would have done very well, but nothing like as well as they do today because of passages of legislation which have vastly strengthened intellectual property rights. And what that means is that if you invent something or if you buy somebody else's invention, you can patent it, okay? And a patent gives you a monopoly income for 20 years. In other words, nobody else can produce that good or service or process. And what TRIPS did is it globalized that process. Before 1994, fewer than 1 million patents were filed each year in the whole world. Today, over 3.5 million are filed every year, and there are over 19 million in force. And what people like Zuckerberg and others have done is use the big financial corporations to buy up hundreds of patents that are actually the process done by other people in universities or wherever, and string them together and have vast monopolies which give them billions and billions of dollars, and nobody can compete with them. And many patents are taken out by American technocrats merely to stop anybody producing with those things. Nobody can produce. They don't produce. Nobody else does, but they stop people producing competitive goods and services. So we've had a dramatic shift, and that's why it's rentier capitalism, because what they're gaining is above what would exist in a free market economy. And that's rent, as we call it in economics. If there was a genuine market system, their surplus would be competed away. Other people would produce, and instead finance people like BlackRock, the vast expense finance corporations of Wall Street, enable a few technocrats to buy up and dominate. This is not due to their brilliance. It's due to legislation that has created a system that is the opposite of a free market economy. If it were a free market economy, then you would soon have competition. I'm not necessarily in favor of a free market economy, but this system is worse than that would be.
Well, there's no exclusivity to rentierism. Anybody can go out and buy property. Anybody can go out and acquire
No, they can't.
intellectual
No, they
property
can't.
rights.
No, they can't. You see, the point is that what happens is the big finance enables a tiny minority to dominate the technology. For example, in Silicon Valley, I've been invited to speak to the big Silicon Valley people, including billionaires there. And they will, in all honesty, they will say, look, the system is rigged for us. I remember one multi-billionaire saying precisely those words to me in public. And he is a very prominent plutocrat, a very big name. And he said, well, I know the system is totally rigged in our favor, and it shouldn't be. And it's unsustainable in the long run because that's his minority, you're a winner takes all situations. So that if you have a slight advantage, it becomes a huge advantage. And the small people can't enter. Every now and then, a small tadpole becomes a frog. But for the most part, it's an exclusivity club who are protecting each other. And it's a tiny minority, but includes some Chinese now, Jack Ma, for example, in China. And there are a few others, of course, and there are some in Malaysia and in India, there are a lot. But they're a tiny minority compared with the world economy. And they're making vast amounts. I mean, that one man can have $400 billion, Musk had recently, $400 billion. It's obscene. It's totally obscene. And he effectively benefits from things that are done by other people. But he gets the big shot money. Same with Jeff Bezos, you've mentioned. I mean, so it's the lack of any sense of balance. It's a lack of any sense of fairness and the capacity for most people to compete against this vast wealth, which comes with power. I mean, the plutocrats are pulling the strings. We saw what Musk did in getting Trump elected last year. I mean, he put $250 million into making sure that Trump won. Without that, I don't think Trump would have won. But that's what happens. And then, of course, they get subsidies from the government, huge subsidies, which are paid for by normal taxpayers. And the end game is that they don't pay any tax either. So, I mean, Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world, he's one of the most honest too. He said, basically, my secretary pays more tax than I pay, okay? And he's also been honest enough to say that in practice, I realize that only about 13 to 15% of my income and wealth is due to myself, my efforts, my skills. It's the system which makes small winners become global huge winners. And it's an unfair system and an
Do you see,
unsustainable.
however, Guy, do you see, however, that there seems to be some kind of devolution of power from the traditional Western powers, whether it's the US or the UK, into other parts of the world, for example, the BRICS? I know China and Xi Jinping with the CCP has talked about how the former paradigm has to change, and he's talked about the common interest idea where wealth is to be shared among more people in China rather than the select few that you discuss. Do you see that kind of development happening?
That's a very interesting set of issues you're touching upon there. My thesis in my books is that after the Second World War, there was what Karl Polanyi, famous author, called the Great Transformation, in which out of the disgusting situation of the 30s, we had welfare state capitalism being introduced, and it was a transformation. And that transformation led to the domination of the United States, of the global economy and society, politically, militarily, and so on. And the United States, for about 50 years, was the dominant rentier state. And when they passed TRIPS in 1994, China was not a member of GATT, which became the World Trade Organization. But China woke up and joined the WTO in 2001. And since then, China has become the dominant leading country for intellectual property rights. It files more patents today than the United States, Europe, and Japan put together. It files more. It is the leading country, and it is becoming the center of economic gravity. And of course, the United States should be seen as a country in economic decline. That's why they've elected Donald Trump, who promises to bring back yesterday, his MAGA movement, but he won't succeed. Well, what they're doing is very similar to what Germany was doing in the 90s, when the Europeans were the declining rentier powers, the United States was the rising power, and they became fascist in orientation, anti-democratic, control with reducing civil liberties and so on and so forth. Precisely what we're seeing Donald Trump do in the United States today, attacking the education institutions, attacking science, attacking freedoms, banning people who are protesting about what's happening in Gaza, etc. There's a sort of illiberality. Meanwhile, China and Southeast Asia have been the rising economic powers. I was back in Kuala Lumpur recently, as you know, and to see how Malaysia has developed economically in the last 30 years is remarkable. If I go to Korea, as I go often, I've seen the same transformation there. Same with China. I get invited to China and talked about the precariat there. Tremendous economic development. But the class structure has also developed. One of the countries that has seen inequality growing very fast is China, very fast. And the president of China is wise enough to know that he has to do something to reduce inequality, because otherwise there will be social and political disruption down the road. And I think the wisdom of the Chinese culture and the wisdom that's embodied in the countries of the whole region, including Korea, will see this new transformation being led by countries in your region. There will be new systems of social protection. That's why I think a lot of countries in the region are interested in basic income. I mean, the new president of South Korea belonged to our network, our basic income network, and introduced a basic income in his province when he was governor of the province, and has told me that he wants to introduce a basic income in Korea. I hope he does. I hope he has the capacity. But I think that the whole region is now the center of economic development, and you will see new institutions. You mentioned the BRICS. We're not sure which way the BRICS are going because it's a contradictory organization. It includes democracies and anti-democracies, if you like, which is not an ideal combination. But it certainly is needed in the sense an alternative to American domination. I worked in the United Nations for 30 years, and multilateralism around the UN has died. It's very tragic. But I think the region that you live in is where the economic dynamics are going to take off.
Well, you talked about how Donald Trump is trying to return America to its former glories, and you think it might fail. But part of that strategy, and I think it is as it is with other countries, is the phenomenon of the rise of the robots, the AIs, which I think they're trying to utilize and accelerate to replace the human workforce. Where, of course, as we know, human frailties dominate, yeah? Robots, they don't take leave, they don't fall sick. They're just a software upgrade and a hardware upgrade away from the next level of productivity. And as we know, economic productivity is the net result of energy, labor force, and productivity. Well, in an era where the labor force is declining, as you mentioned, and populations are shrinking, the robots are here and they're coming fast. My question to you is, how much more of a phenomenon does the precariat become in an era of robots and in an era of AI?
Well, to start with, I've just finished a new book which deals with a lot of the AI issues. And I've always argued that new technologies have a greater impact on the distribution of income rather than on reducing labor and work and so on. And I don't believe that this revolution around AI and automation is going to mean the end of work. I think there's plenty of work for all of us to do. I think what it is doing is increasing inequalities, because the owners of the robots, the owners of AI, the dominant people are getting more and more of that rent. I'm very interested. I had a conversation with Sam Altman, who is the leading voice, and he's come round to supporting a basic income. I don't agree with him and others that we're going to have the end of work. I think that's too much. But I think beyond doubt, it's going to increase the inequalities and the insecurities of people who are doing jobs and labor, and that those insecurities are becoming threatening to our life systems, because people who are insecure become incredibly stressed. They suffer from heart problems. They suffer from mental problems. They suffer from all sorts of other social and political problems. And we need to tackle that insecurity that's linked to the AI. And the other aspect of it, which doesn't receive enough attention, is that the AI strengthens the capacity of minorities to manipulate the minds and the behavior of the majority. The idea of a panopticon state, that surveillance and control of us could be the future, is a dystopia that we should all fear. We should all want to see control of the systems of AI. And those who are involved, who are intelligent and moral enough, understand that. They understand that what they're letting loose, as it were, is potentially a Frankenstein's monster. And it needs to be regulated and controlled by society in a democratic way. And we are at a dangerous point where unscrupulous politicians or minorities could manipulate the technologies against us, against you and me and all the people listening. And we need to be aware of that and have a politics which says, no, we must have that for society, for all of us, for the benefit. And I think that we're going to see that debate, but I don't believe it will mean that we'll have nothing else to do except to sit back and watch Netflix or whatever your preference is. I think we are actually in a point where it could be a liberating technology. It could enable us to spend more time caring for our children, caring for our loved ones, doing voluntary work, doing communal work. And that prospect means you have to have a political process to gain control of it. And that's where basic income comes in the discussion.
He talks about how you've seen an emergence in Southeast Asia, at least, of an affinity for some kind of basic income. Well, Malaysia has tried to do its own version of wealth redistribution in the past via policies like the new economic policy and so on and so forth. In your discussions with the administrations present and past, Guy, what kind of feedback can you give in terms of the mindset, the thinking of the Malaysian governments where this whole issue of social protection is concerned?
Well, I was privileged to have a discussion with your Prime Minister recently and your Minister of Finance. And I was arguing that with subsidy rationalization, you could free up resources. The Malaysian economic context, where you have a nucleus of a sovereign wealth fund, means that actually developing a capital fund, what I call a commons capital fund, whereby you could direct investment for building and sustaining infrastructure, ecological, sustainable industries, and so on, and build up that fund, and from the fund pay out a dividend to every citizen of the country, every usual legal resident of Malaysia. Just as you could do it in Korea, you can do it in Japan, you can do it in Indonesia, where they've built up sovereign wealth funds. And these sovereign wealth funds are compatible with directing economic, sustainable industries and ecologically desirable directions, but they're also a mechanism of reducing the inequalities, potentially. But that means using them in a democratic way and distributing equally to every individual, a gradually rising amount. I believe you need eco-taxes, carbon taxes, and so on. And that's the future, because we've got to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels and so on. And the only way to do that is to raise the price. But you can't raise the price just by itself, because that will hit poor people more than rich people. You have to promise to recycle the revenue of that in paying out to equal amounts as a basic income or a common dividend. That's, I think, the way to go. I hope that's the way that the president of Korea is going. I was in Thailand recently, where the Basic Income Party has a very, very strong presence in parliament. And I was elaborating on that theme there, and they understand it. And we're seeing a lot of pilots and experiments which are very promising. So while in Malaysia you haven't yet moved in that direction, the NEP was not something terribly successful, although it obviously reduced structural inequalities between the different groups in society. But I mean, it's not addressed the problem of insecurity or the growth of the precariat. So for me, you need to go further than that. We need to recycle the rents, in effect.
All of what you discussed, Guy, presupposes a solution comes from the top down rather than the bottom up. And a top-down approach also presupposes an equitable and a responsible and right-thinking government. And as we know, in certain developing economies, we don't always have that level of credential. What can people do for themselves from the bottom up to help mitigate the effects of what you described to be a truism in today's society?
Question. I think it's a very good question. But I think a basic income as an anchor for social protection effectively empowers people at the local level. Basically what it does, it says every individual in every community has a certain modest amount. It gives them security. Then they're invited to make their own lives. You've got that as your right, and now it's up to you to take advantage. What we saw in Korea, for example, is that Lee introduced in his province a basic income for all young people age 16 to 25. They all received a basic income. And what happened was that they increased entrepreneurship, they increased small-scale businesses, they increased their training and skills and so on, and increased their confidence capacity to help build their local communities. And I think that this leads to the work that I've been doing over the past 10 years on the commons. The commons are what belongs to everybody. The natural commons, the commons that the land, the sea, the air, and the social commons, the institutions inherited by our generation, built up by many, many generations before us, be it in Malaysia or anywhere else. And the commons are what are local by nature. And we need to build the commons, and so local communities have a sense of solidarity, reciprocity, and empathy as they develop. And we've seen that. We did a big pilot in India, in Madhya Pradesh, where we provided a basic income for a whole lot of villages. And what happened was an increase in social solidarity, an interest in cooperatives, an interest in sanitation, collective sanitation, building the community. And that sense of local is empowering and liberating, which is what we need. I totally agree with you. We don't need a top-down paternalistic state. We need to escape from that. And that means giving people the capacity to make decisions themselves, including the formation of democratic civil society groups. But that only comes when people have resources and confidence. And that happens when you give people enough security, enough economic security, then their better instincts come to the fore, and they participate in initiatives. And we've seen that in many countries now where we've been involved in pilots and experiments. I've seen it in Southern Africa, I've seen it in Brazil, seen it in Canada, and it's marked by giving people the capacity to have their own power in a good sense, and their confidence and their health improves and reduced stress, and then they become better citizens. I don't think it's fair of the state to expect citizens to be decent if they're living in chronic insecurity.
I had exactly the same discussion with Sarath some months ago, and I said to him, obviously the political benefit that comes from introducing a basic income is insurmountable. It affects everybody because the 5 tenets of the basic income that you guys at BIEN, basically, BIEN, advocating is actually very equitable. I think there's irrespective of background, irrespective of age, irrespective of anything, everybody gets the same amount, everybody in the country, regardless of any of the above. And I think that's interesting. However, I've not yet seen one country anywhere in the world which has applied that exact formula in its exact definition. It might have applied it in certain limited quantities, but not in the broad swath that you have defined it as. I'm wondering why.
Well, let me answer that question. I've had that question put to me many, many times. Throughout history, people have said the same thing about any potential new policy. Before we had pensions, people said it's impossible to have pensions. It's impossible. They will never happen. They will never happen. Then they happened. Before there were unemployment benefits, people said you'll never have unemployment benefits. It's impossible. Same with family benefits. Never happen. Will never happen. Then we have it. And we're in a new era where we've got a chronic uncertainty, as I mentioned at the beginning. This is a new phenomenon. We don't have an industrial society. We don't have an agrarian society. We have a society where the precariat is the dominant class. And that class is chronically insecure, and it needs a new form of social protection. If we don't give it, we will have fascism. And that, unfortunately, is what's happened in the past. Because the politicians or movements have not been prepared to confront the challenges of their time, then we get a lurch into extremism, populism and fascism and so on, and violence. And only after a war or something like that do we get a new transformation. And that's what's happened in the 30s and the 40s. The beverage welfare system that developed after 1945 was in response to the failures of the 1930s. Now, I hope that we don't need another war situation, although we've got war in the Middle East and we've got war in Ukraine and so on, but we need to confront the great crisis of our time, which is chronic insecurity for millions and millions of people who are living on the edge of unsustainable debt and stress. We're having a rise of suicides among young people, particularly a rise in young women around the world. We're seeing a lot more morbidity of illnesses, chronic illnesses. I came and spoke at a conference in KL recently on living to 100. Well, a lot of people will never live to even 50 because the stresses and strains lead them to having cardiac problems, mental problems, suicidal problems, and become violent non-citizens. So we're at a crisis point, and I believe that we need to recognize that, and that is the context in which we should be open to new policies. That's why I'm so excited by what's happening in Korea. We now have a president for the first time who believes in that. And I've had several conversations with him, and I believe he's a good man. We see young politicians, ecologically driven politicians coming through who are prepared to move in this direction. At the moment, we have well over 100 pilots taking place, including in many US cities. If you told me 10 years ago that would be the case, I would say dream, dream, dream. You know what I mean? So we are seeing a change. We have seen various areas where something close to a basic income has been delivered. I remember having a long discussion with President Lula in Brazil in 2010. And he told me, he said, I know I was only re-elected president of Brazil because of our Bolsa Familia, which is a form of basic income. And he said, I would like to move further in that direction to have a basic income for the country. Now, he's back as president, and we're about to have our next Congress in Brazil. I'm not particularly confident that it's going to take place in Brazil first. I've got several bets on other countries getting there first, but there's always has to be a first, and there will be.
What about the UK and the rest of Europe, Guy? I mean, I spent a long time in the UK, which I regard as my second home in school and in university, and I see all kinds of news headlines which suggest that there's fissures in the social system. Urban disturbances, pockets of dissent, in fact, more than a few pockets of dissent, not just in the UK, in Germany as well, in France, other parts of developed Europe. And it seems as if the administrations there, the governments, don't seem to quite have a handle on how to handle essentially this widening inequality at home. What's your sense of what's happening at home for you?
I'm extremely worried about what's happening in Europe at the moment. We have the end game, if you like, of social democracy. The Labour Party in Britain is floundering. Where I'm talking to you from in Italy, the old left party are dying. The same in Germany, they've all faded. And we have the rise of the far right, fascists in many cases, racists and misogynists and so on. Many of them aligned with Trump in the United States. We have Orban in Hungary, we have Meloni in Italy, we have Nigel Farage rising. And at the moment, the old left, if you like, has just got no answers. In a sense, they're dead men walking. As a politician whom I've met several times says in Italy, they're dead men walking. And they're holding up change. I was an economic advisor to John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn in between 2016 and 2019. And there was a flutter of enthusiasm. They got more votes for the Labour Party than Starmer did last year, but this time the Conservatives were so weak that they just faded. But we have a situation where the drift to the far right is frightening. I'm genuinely frightening. And it leads to a very autocratic strain of anti-democracy. So I don't think at the moment we're in a healthy situation in Europe, but I believe there's energy out there. I believe there are millions of people who belong to the precariat and are demanding a new politics. I cannot tell you how many organizations invite me to give talks about the precariat, and there is a lot of energy. But at the moment, we're in a sort of interregnum between the old social democratic welfare state situations. And you saw that in the United States with the Democrats not being able to put up a coherent program against what Trump was offering. But Trump is not offering anything for the precariat, but he mobilized enough of them to support him because he promised to bring back yesterday. And the same with Farage in Britain or the AfD in Germany. They're promising yesterday. They're promising to bring back yesterday, which is a white supremacist behind the scenes, very carefully crafted so they don't use racist language, but it actually embodies a racist ideology, a eugenicist ideology. The strong must be surviving, the weak must be allowed to die out. And that leads back to a key point you made earlier, and I don't know if Sarath made it in his talk with you, that a basic income doesn't mean that everybody gets the same. Because if you are a person with disabilities, for example, you need a higher amount in order to give you an equivalent level of basic security to a person who doesn't have disabilities. So what we advocate is that everybody should have a basic income, which gradually could rise as the resources are mobilized. But people with disabilities, people with very young children, would have an extra amount because they have extra costs to meet. And it doesn't mean that you abolish all other forms of welfare and social policy. That is not true. You allow that to exist. So you can have social insurance, you can have unemployment benefits, you can have disability benefits. Those can continue to exist, but you have a base, a guaranteed base. And what you want to do is you tell everybody, you have that base. Now it's up to you to make something of your life. And that, I think, is a liberating, democratic, decent, dignified way of treating people. But I think it's important to realize that you're not abolishing the social state. You're not abolishing the capacity of governments to invest in schooling or health services or anything like that. But it's a base. It gives people a basic security.
I don't think anyone will disagree with you about the benefits of such a basic income. But, Guy, I think what you're suggesting presupposes a government that does the right thing by its people. And it doesn't always happen that way, especially in developing Asia. So what can people do for themselves from the bottom up if it takes too long for the policymakers to get their acts together, essentially?
I think I don't want to be cynical, and I don't think you're being cynical, but I think that we must realize that political change has always come from the bottom when people see a vision that they can identify with. And they need that vision. It may be a utopian one, or it may be a fairly modest one, but there must be a united feeling that not only do we want change, but we can see the direction of change we want to see. And when that happens, then you have the development of movements. Young politicians will come through, young people with idealistic narratives to give, and that mobilizes the energy. I mean, one of the problems, of course, I don't want to be rude to any individual, but one of the problems, of course, in Asia has been a gerontocracy in terms of politics. Too many of the elderly have held on for too long. I don't want to mention anybody's 100th birthday this month, but it has been a thing holding back social and political progress in various countries. But I think that what is happening is young, and particularly young women are becoming more energized. And that energy is something that is great. And it's always happened when you get a period of potential transformation. And my role, I feel, and my role when I say not just me, but our organization and other people with similar ideas, is to say to the next generation, it's up to you. Have backbone, have courage, demand change. In a sense, demand the impossible, because then you will get the possible. And I think it's this energy which has been lacking, because for too long, our education system and our politics and our media encouraged everyone to look after number one, themselves. Be competitive. Be better than anybody else. And stressing that side. And it's an ugly development. It leads to people being selfish, egotistical, narcissistic, and dismiss people who are not clever as failures. This is a language that I detest. And I think there is a large body of young people who are demanding change, wanting change, and it's up to us, including people like yourself in the media, to say, look, change is possible, radical change is possible, and not only possible, but essential today. Because otherwise we're going to drift back into a very ugly period like the 90s. And we're seeing it in the Middle East. We're seeing ugly genocidal trends, which are the derivative of allowing the global economy to be dominated by a tiny minority, including the arms industry, most of all, and the finance industry, who don't give a damn about, but don't give anything for those people who are suffering at the bottom. And we're seeing genocide as something that's not being attacked enough. It's disgusting. So I think there is a lot of energy out there, and our job is to say, go for it. Go for it.
I think you're right, Guy, and I think that Malaysia, out of all the countries that you've discussed, has one of the better chances of introducing such a policy because
Yes.
certainly from a resource standpoint, Malaysia's got a lot, and it can, I guess, reallocate its resources much more wisely. I do hope we can have this conversation again down the line. I do hope that the next time we talk, it will be in person. I know you visit this region a lot, and if the stars do collide in the right direction, I think it is entirely possible that in 5 years' time, it will be a very different world. I think if what you suggest comes true. So thank you, Guy. Any parting
Thank you very
shots
much
for the audience in terms of even policymakers who might be listening in? What are your parting thoughts on this issue?
Well, John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist of the 20th century, said anything we really need, we can afford. We can afford to move in this direction, and I believe it is essential. So I encourage your politicians to remember their legacy. Your Prime Minister wants to leave a legacy. The best way he could do that is to alter the distribution of income in Malaysia by giving people basic security. And that would be a wonderful legacy. And if he doesn't do it, I hope some younger politicians will come in to do that for him. But thank you very much for this platform to talk to you. And I hope and wish the best for Malaysia, a beautiful country, a fabulous country. And I think it has a great future.
That was fantastic, Guy. Thank you so much for your time. Of course, Professor Guy Standing of SOAS in London, talking to us about the redistribution of income for the labour force around the world. Thank you, Guy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers.